Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Afghanistan. No pay, they walk away. Hi, everybody. You're listening to the Tamar, Yonah Show here at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. How is it that an American-trained military with over 250,000 people did not fight and let the Taliban just walk in? Now, according to the words of U.S. President Joe Biden, he himself said that they had left Afghanistan with 300,000 troops there of Afghani origin, that they taught the Afghanis how to fight, they supplied them with military gear, etc., and they had an air force, and yet the Taliban was just able to walk in. What happened? This is the question we're going to answer today. And already Iran is ready to pounce on Afghanistan. So how is this going to change the region? This is very, very important. These are very important developments that are going on. It should concern all of us. It should concern Americans because the good name of the American people has been damaged by walking away and leaving its allies in Afghanistan to the fate of the Taliban. Already reports of the Taliban going door to door, taking weapons away from people, saying you don't need it. Already women being barred from universities. They wanted to go to university to finish up their degree, to go back to school. They were barred from entering the university. Will it go back to where women were not educated, were not allowed to go to school? Will it go back to where women are taken as sex slaves, where women were taken as brides for their Taliban soldiers, where women and children were taken as human slaves there? What kind of retribution will we see by the Taliban to those who were trying to scramble to get on planes to get out of there, like we saw in the 60s and the early 70s, etc., what was going on in Vietnam and Saigon? Very, very disturbing. We're going to talk all about this and get some answers. We'll be right back.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
All right, we are back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com, and we're asking a lot of questions today. One is, how did an American-trained military of over 250,000 people, remember, Joe Biden said he left an Afghan army of 300,000 soldiers, that's over 250,000 soldiers, trained by the superpower of the world, the American people, left with an air force and with military gear, etc. How could it be that there was no fight and the Taliban were just able to walk in? There are reports that the Afghani army, listen to this, there are reports that the Afghani army and the police were not getting paid for 6 months or more. The Washington Post reports, quote, they saw the U.S. commitment to a full withdrawal as an assurance that the militants, meaning the Taliban, would return to power in Afghanistan, and they wanted to secure their place on the winning side. The Doha Agreement, designed to bring an end to the war in Afghanistan. That was under Trump, but this was supposed to be a slow withdrawal and an agreement with the Taliban. Instead, Biden had the troops go out without any agreement with the Taliban and just left everything. Instead, left Afghan forces demoralized. And moving on in this article, it says, quote, listen to this. Some police officers complained that they had not been paid in 6 months or more. That, my friends, is exactly after Biden took over the presidency 7 months ago. So what we're looking at is an apparent fact here. It looks like a fact that the Biden administration stopped paying the Afghan military and police. And if you're not getting paid and the other side is going to pay you, then you're not going to fight. George Washington, his troops were going to leave him because they weren't getting paid. He needed to cross what was the story? He needed to cross the Potomac River, and then but his soldiers were going to desert him. But then he finally got money. I think he got a bottle of booze and he got some money, and he paid them, and they stayed with him, and they won that battle. And didn't that turn the story of the American Revolution against Britain? If you don't pay your troops, they're not going to fight. And this all, the last 6 months, Biden took office 7 months ago. So what does that tell you? I'll let you answer that question yourself. Our guest today is Barry Shaw. He's the International Public Diplomacy Director at the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. His books include Fighting Hamas, BDS and Anti-Semitism, etc., etc. He's got lots of books. You can check them out on Amazon or at your local Steinmatsky bookstore here in Israel. You can visit his website at strategic-israel.org and theviewfromisrael.com. Welcome to the show, Barry Shaw.
Thank you, Tamar. Thank you for having me.
All right, Afghanistan has fallen. I physically hurt for the people who are trapped there, who cannot get out, that the Taliban is going to want to get retribution on. They're going to want to get back at them, any of the diplomatic staff and or families, any of the translators that work there, any journalists that still couldn't get out, other family members and people who worked for the embassy or worked with the government, the former Afghan government. They are not, it's not going to be a pretty picture for them at all. What are we looking at?
Well, I'll tell you, I've been studying this from a strategic analysis on behalf of the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies. And there's a lot to glean out of what's been happening and why it happened, which I'm going to share with you and your listeners today. An intelligence analyst, Robert Gates, who was a Secretary of Defense under Obama with Biden as vice president, infamously said of Joe Biden in 2014 that Biden had been wrong on every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades. I said that in 2014. So I guess you can now add another 7 years onto that, especially faced in the disaster that is Afghanistan. And what Biden did in Afghanistan was not just a local disaster in that area, it was an international embarrassment and the creation of a potentially deadly and uncontrollable series of events. Biden did in one foolish, impulsive act. Either he overrode the military advice or he took the military advice. But the result was that he's gifted Afghanistan to a lethal Islamic Sharia terror organization. And you know what, Tamar? This is the point, a significant timely point. He did it less than 1 month before the 20th anniversary of 9/11, when al-Qaeda terrorists came out of that country, Afghanistan, into the United States, learned to fly in America before hijacking planes and flying them into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon killing almost 3,000 Americans and injuring 6,000 more. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans who served in Afghanistan. A lot of those left limbs in Afghanistan, left their eyesight in Afghanistan, who are cringing today in America over what Biden has done. Tamar, about 9/11, traditionally, the President of the United States visits Ground Zero in New York on the anniversary to honor the dead and lay a wreath. I don't know how Biden can show his face there next month. I think they will probably do it. We're keeping the public away, because I think you would find the public will publicly and noisily demonstrate against Biden should he go to Ground Zero on 9/11 next month. The rage, the pain that I'm hearing from those who served in Afghanistan, who lost loved ones there, who left, as I said, their limbs and their sight there, they are angry at their president and his administration for blowing away everything they had fought for and
Oh, did we lose Barry? Okay, we're going to check and see what happened to Barry.
And blamed it on Trump, right? But as I've written in an article that Biden is about to follow President Ford and Carter into the U.S. Hall of Shame, not fame, shame, by doing this. You know, we had the thing about Gerald Ford was embarrassed out of office by a shameful newsreel of embassy staff clambering on board a helicopter on the roof of the Saigon U.S. Embassy, right? You remember that one?
Yes.
This is his Saigon moment. Jimmy Carter left the White House shamed by the vision of U.S. Embassy staff being marched blindfold out of the Kabul Embassy in Afghanistan, hands in the air, in supine surrender to the goons of the Islamic regime, led by Ahmadinejad, who became president.
You're talking about
This
Iran.
is Biden's moment. Go ahead.
You were talking about, you mean Tehran and Iran, not Kabul, Afghanistan.
Tehran, sorry. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So you have with the Kabul, with Tehran, and also with Saigon. Now you have Biden's moment in Kabul. You're right. Listen, what Biden went on television and he said there would be no scenes of people being lifted off the roof of the embassy. But what did we see yesterday? You're watching the scenes of Afghans being killed, trying to grab onto a giant U.S. military transport plane as it taxied and took off with Afghans clinging on the side of the plane. That is worse than what we saw in Saigon. That was worse than what we saw in Iran. It was a catastrophe on his watch. Basically, the mission was originally to prevent Afghanistan from being a haven for terrorism, and it is now becoming an epicenter of terror. And the U.S. has abandoned the Afghan people and left them to their fate of the jihadi terrorists.
Barry.
I want to tell you, there was a budget a few months ago, one of these bloated budget that Democrats have been passing a few months ago. It was in that budget that they gave a whole bunch of money back to the Palestinian Authority, despite their pay-to-slave problem. We discussed it on an earlier program. You remember that? Well, part of that blatant budget, there was a huge chunk of money that went to Afghanistan. You know what for? For gender equality education in Afghanistan, including in the military.
You know what? Maybe it is good that America
left. So these are the priorities of the Democrat government under Biden. It's all to do with critical race theory and things like this.
Barry, I want to interrupt you for a second, and I want to say that I'm looking at pictures right now of masses of people in Afghanistan trying to get onto planes to get out of there before retribution is taken upon them. And I was listening to news reports yesterday on the news because it's morning, very early morning here right now in Israel, and they were saying that the Biden administration is looking for some way to try to get them visas to get in, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm thinking, visas? You're letting in all of these quote unquote undocumented people on your southern border. You don't know who they are. You don't know what countries they're coming from, that they're pouring through the southern border without visas. You're letting them in. You're taking them on buses, taking them to cities. And these poor people who are running for their lives that you were supposed to protect as an ally, you have a responsibility towards them. That they need visas. You can't take in. Them you can't take in. All right, we're going to be right back.
Well, I said.
Hi, I'm Steve Miller.
And I'm Matt Zucker.
Join us for Lighten Up, where we take a look at the week's current events in Israel and from around the Jewish world through a humorous lens.
If you've been paying attention during these crazy times, you know that it's a challenge to parody life anymore. But join Steve and I as we give it the old college try. Not only is being happy an obligation, but life is just too short to take it all so seriously.
So join me, Steve Miller.
And me, Matt Zucker.
For Lighten Up every Monday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 5 p.m. Israel, only on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
All right, we are back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com, and we're talking about the fall of Afghanistan. What we're trying to answer questions on why there was no fighting, why the Taliban was just able to walk in. Before I bring my guest back on, I just want to read here a post from Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is an American politician. She says, I just got off White House briefing for Congress concerning Afghanistan. Joe Biden, she writes, is a fool. The military equipment and arms were left on purpose in Afghanistan for the Afghan military to supposedly defend themselves, but they have handed it all over with no resistance. So now the Taliban, who had very little, has American military equipment. 5,000 prisoners have been released from the base, known terrorists they are. Our border is wide open and out of control. These terrorists can easily make their way to the United States. The Taliban is in full control, and the ISIS is there as well. Trump defeated ISIS, and Biden is to blame for their imminent rise. Turkey and Pakistan are going to soon move in to stabilize, quote unquote, Afghanistan. That's the word they're going to use. We're moving in order to stabilize Afghanistan. But now it's not just Turkey and Pakistan. It's Iran also. Iran is also waiting to pounce on Afghanistan. So, Barry, where would you like to begin?
Yeah, well, I just want to expose again, and I'm sad to say this, but we see it repeatedly. He blamed it on Trump. He blamed it on everybody himself. When Biden's not reading off prepared cue cards or plagiarizing other people's speeches or mumbling incoherently, he is lying. And he lied when he tried to pin the blame on Trump. Let me tell you the difference. He accused Trump of agreeing to have a deal with Taliban at a meeting at Camp David, where he hid for a week. He was hiding in Camp David when this was going on. He didn't come out for several days because he had to be prepared to go to the White House, read off cue cards or the teleprompter for 20 minutes. And instead of staying in Camp David and doing his job as commander-in-chief, he went back to his vacation in Camp David. But I want to tell you what actually happened with Trump. Trump was supposed to have had a meeting with the Taliban at Camp David. And the arrangement was there was going to be a power sharing agreement between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And what Trump did that Biden didn't do was he told the Taliban, if you veer from this arrangement and take up your violence and terrorism to take on the country, I am going to do to you what I did to ISIS. And he told the Taliban leaders, you know what I did with ISIS. What did I do with the ISIS leader? This is going to happen to you if you veer from this agreement. Biden never did this. So he was lying about the agreement, what he did was one that's simply repeating what Trump had agreed to. This is wrong. So I want to add last night also, by the way, Tamar, in light of coming on your show today, that I had a conversation last night with Colonel Richard Kemp. Most of your listeners know about Richard Kemp for his passionate support for Israel and the IDF. Richard Kemp, by the way, commanded British forces in Afghanistan, where, and this is a side story, after consulting with an Israeli general in a London hotel, he's told me this story personally, before heading to Afghanistan, he put together an unconventional force of British and US troops in 2003, and with the proper intelligence, not the intelligence that went on this time, he conducted a counter-terrorist strategy against the Taliban that set them back. And he did that after consulting with a top Israeli general in London. Richard added another mistake, major mistake, that Biden and his military advisors like General Mark Milley, who's the Joint Chief of Staff chief, made when they chose the height of the Taliban fighting season, where the Taliban are at the peak of their abilities, of their equipment, and mobile, being kinetic on the battlefront, to plan their withdrawal. Richard said you never do a withdrawal when that. If you have to understand what this fighting season is, the Taliban in the winter go back to their villages in the hills of Kandahar and some other remote places to look after their goats and their wives and whatever. And it should have been done in winter when the Taliban had returned to their and helped with their agriculture or whatever they do over there. And instead of that, we've seen the sight of the U.S. military being driven out of Afghanistan by basically bearded goat herders. And I can tell you that the NATO allies were stunned, as Richard told me. You remember when Biden went to a G7 meeting and told the Europeans that America was back, you know?
Yes.
So they watched him. And what did he do to them in Afghanistan? He left them in the lurch. The British are absolutely livid. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, had several covert Cobra meetings about this thing. And they have to also send back troops into Afghanistan in order to take out the British personnel and the British citizens from that country.
Wow.
Biden left, and now what is he doing? He's sending back about up to 7,000 troops back into Kabul and another 4,000 to Kuwait as an emergency reserve force. And as Richard told me, America's credibility with NATO and the British and with Europe is absolutely lost. And I want to tell you, it must be severely damaged with Israel. I'd love to be a fly on the wall when Benny Gantz met with Aviv Kochavi, the Israel Chief of Staff, to discuss what was America's blunder. If the NATO nations felt deserted, what might happen to the future of Iran, where will America stay first, or would they fold? You know, Israel is assessing this thing. And when we go forward, whether actions take place in Syria against Iran, or in fact in Iran itself, you will find that there's something that Benny Gantz said just over a week ago, that when he was going to America to meet with Mark Milley, that if Israel doesn't get any support, Israel will have to do it on our own. And I think after this American blunder, the talk in the Kiryat in Tel Aviv is going to be one of, we have to do it on our own.
So go ahead.
I was just going to say, the other thing that I raised, actually Richard raised it, is another potential problem. I described to him what I see the outcome's going to be in Afghanistan. It is going to be the biggest terror state in the world. They already have released Al-Qaeda and ISIS prisoners from all the jails over there. They will be making arrangements with Hezbollah. The fields of Afghanistan that were red with the blood of US forces and British as well are going to be red with poppies, because Hezbollah is already doing a drug trade with the Taliban. And this is going to be a major source of income for international terrorism via the drug trade. So you're going to see a coalition of the Taliban, together with ISIS, together with Al-Qaeda, and together with Hezbollah. And God help us when they get their act together in maybe another 2 years and 3 years, and we find that they start striking at Western targets throughout the world.
Right. It'll be a well-oiled machine by then. And so I'm just looking at some of these posts on Twitter from people posting from Afghanistan, etc. And there's footage here of interviews with women who they are in fear that they're going to be raped. They're going to be put into forced marriages with Taliban soldiers. Many of them are trying to flee to protect their honor, as they put it. This is very frightening to see what is going to happen with the women, who's just a commodity for this type of regime and ideology. In the last 2 minutes of this segment, Barry, where do you want to go?
Yeah, well, I want to put an emphasis on what's happening in the U.S. military, which has been a great military up till now, and I want to put the emphasis on this General Mark Milley. General Mark Milley, for the last few months, has been introducing and indoctrinating his senior officers with a course, and bring it down to the rank and file soldier, of introducing this craze that's going on in America of critical race theory. And this seems to be more of an obsession to him, of introducing this theory than leading a critical military exercise. Is this what the U.S. military really needs to do today? I think you saw they're complaining about the collapse of the Afghan army. I think what we're going to see in the future is a collapse of the effectiveness and ability of the U.S. army, that is basically demoralized right now with the introduction of these Black Lives Matter theories of gender and race theory. And we saw this. We saw this with what Mark Milley said about a month ago, where he said that the Afghan security forces, he said a few weeks ago, have a capacity to sufficiently fight and defend their country. I want to emphasize, he said repeatedly, a negative outcome, a Taliban military takeover, is not a foregone conclusion. This is the top leader of the U.S. military. He was crushingly wrong.
Okay, Barry, hold it right there, because we have to go to a break. And when we get back, I'm going to be asking you about how all of this will affect Israel and the rest of the world, and an important Swedish trial that has implications for Israel and the world. We'll be right back.
Are you tired of political correctness and the fear that you might offend someone?
I'm not afraid to offend you.
Wow, look who's talking tough.
One has to be tough to keep sane today.
Hi, I'm Alan Skorsky.
And I'm Bela Seabrow.
And join us every Wednesday for The Definitive Wrap as we interview the most sought-after guests and expose progressive trends that masquerade as enlightenment but actually destroy our freedoms.
We are the No Woke Zone, so buckle up to this exciting show.
Buckling up, but I'm driving.
Sure, you can drive, but I'm the navigator.
Tune in for the No Nonsense, The Definitive Wrap Show, every Wednesday on Israel News Talk Radio.
All right, we are back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Our guest is Barry Shaw, and we're trying to answer the questions on how everything that happened in Afghanistan happened and why. And my further question to you in this last segment, Barry, is how will this affect Israel and the rest of the world? And just during the break, I was reading here that there's an interview between Greta Van Susteren of Fox News past, she's not there anymore, and U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, dated back July 18th, 2010. So we're talking 11 years ago, where Secretary Clinton, at that time, Hillary was the Secretary of State, admitted, it says here, that the U.S. government created and funded the terrorist group Taliban and Al-Qaeda that they're fighting today. Now, I did not watch this interview yet, but I want to get your take on this thing that was tweeted.
Well, you mentioned Hillary Clinton, but there again, here we go again. If you remember another American fiasco under Hillary Clinton as Obama's Secretary of State, shall I mention it, Benghazi, where she left an ambassador and a security team in the lurch to be killed by terrorists there in Libya.
Yes.
I want to raise another point, that the Deputy Secretary of State under Hillary Clinton was, guess who? Anthony Blinken, the current Secretary of State.
Interesting.
The current one. So he was an incompetent then, and he's an incompetent today. And I just want to finish up this wrap, and it was shameful to hear the President of the United States beg the Taliban to spare the United States Embassy until he had sent in the removers to evacuate his personnel. And just hours after he said that at a press meeting, you know what he says, and I'm quoting here, the Taliban is not remotely like the Vietnamese army, because he was asked about is this the Saigon army at a moment. And he said, the Taliban is not remotely like the Vietnamese army. They are not comparable. Really? He said that just 8 days before the Taliban drove out the U.S. army that surrendered to these ragbag bunch of sheep herders.
So, Barry, how is this going to affect the rest of us now in the world? You know, people are watching the scenes on television, on their phones, on their computers, or seeing footage.
Well, there's going to be a lot of appeals by the United Nations and the Europeans and by Biden that this is a moment where the Taliban can prove themselves to be a regular democratic entity for the good of their country. Tamar, this is exactly the nonsense you get where you're talking about it's Israel to blame for what's going on with the Palestinians, and they're appealing to the Palestinian Authority and to Hamas to really become a normal democratic regime on behalf of to bring peace and security and prosperity to their people. This is the delusion that's been going on for decades over Israel, that it's always Israel's fault that there's never a two-state solution, because the poor Palestinians and Hamas and Islamic Jihad, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, really wants a peace and really wants security for their people. Now we're starting to hear this nonsense with regard to the Taliban. Well, the Taliban, this is your golden moment to make power and bring peace and prosperity to your people. It's a lot of nonsense, delusional dreams that's not based in any reality. The Taliban is the Taliban is the Taliban, and their cohorts are going to be Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hezbollah, even Hamas, and they are supported by China, Iran, Russia, and Pakistan. It has to be Pakistan because Pakistan are scared stiff that the strong Taliban and terror regime across their border, if they overturn the regime in Pakistan, remember Pakistan is a nuclear country, and it's weak government with a weak government. And if the Taliban, what happens in the new Afghanistan, take over Pakistan, you're going to have a nuclear-armed terror regime.
Wow, that's horrible. Can you imagine the Taliban with nuclear capability, nuclear weapons? All right, so this is the very big danger to the world that you've already explained that to us, that they can have a chance now if they gain power, and they're going to get a lot of money from those poppy fields that are in the drug trade in Afghanistan, that if they do get hold of nuclear weapons, oy vavoy, as we say. But what about the opposite? What happens if Turkey or Pakistan or Iran now see Afghanistan as this is the time to pounce, and they take over Afghanistan?
Don't forget who are the countries that have already very quickly got off the blocks and supported the Taliban regime? Russia.
China.
That's one. Iran. That's another. China. These are the people that are now giving the bear hug to the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and I believe that their embassies are the only ones that are functioning in Afghanistan right now as well, that are functioning normally, I should say. So, okay, so this
who's isolated? Who's isolated? The United States under Biden have really upset NATO and Britain and all these countries. Out of this outcome, the isolated nation is the United States of America.
And their name has been damaged as being a reliable ally, which is very, very sad. Very, very sad. All right, we need to end here for this topic, because I know there was something else you wanted to talk about, and that was a very important Swedish trial that has implications for Israel and the world. We only have less than 5 minutes, 4 minutes.
Okay, well, I'll make it fast. Yeah, a court case opened up in Sweden, right? And you say, well, why is Barry Shaw discussing this with Tamar on the show? I'll just go through it pretty quickly. Last week, we saw the opening of a criminal trial in Sweden following the arrest of a 60-year-old man called Hamid Nouri. Hamid Nouri was arrested in November 2019 when he arrived in Stockholm. And he was taken into a room at the airport where he was interrogated about his past. And he was arrested and placed in detention. Why was he arrested? Why was he placed in detention? And why is he now in a major court case in Sweden? Because Hamid Nouri was a senior Iranian official responsible for the judicial murder, torture, murder, and execution of thousands of Iranians in Iran from 1988. The arrest of Nouri came about as a result of detailed research being done by Iranian human rights activists. And the trial's unique. It's the first time that an Iranian high official is facing his victims on charges of mass murder and human rights crimes and war crimes. It's basically for the Iranians their equivalent of the Eichmann trial in 1961. Now, what's the connection? Recently, the Islamic Republic of Iran held their elections, and Ebrahim Raisi was inaugurated as their country's new president. And for international diplomats and human rights organizations, this was a tremendous setback, because Raisi is known to those who opposed his election as the Butcher of Tehran, based on his reign of terror against his political opponents throughout Iran, starting over 30 years ago. And as the head of the Iranian judiciary at that time, Raisi presided over the crackdown of thousands of peaceful protesters and members of minority groups who were arrested, tortured, and summarily executed in the most barbaric manner. You don't know about this, but thousands of Iranians have been executed in covert, in secret, including women and children. And it was led by people like Raisi, the new president of Iran. And one of his top honchos was the guy who's now standing trial in Sweden, Hamid Nouri. Now, I did a video, and if people want to go to YouTube and search for it, you can find it, about this court case, with a lawyer called Kenneth Lewis. And he represents 4 of the 29 plaintiffs who were witness to the executions. and witnessed or gave testimony of what happens, and the personal involvement not only of Nori but also of Raisi himself. And this trial is going to go on, he told me, until at least April of next year.
Okay, so we only have a minute left, Barry. So how does this now affect Israel and the rest of the world?
Because we've left it up to the United States to negotiate with Iran over a nuclear deal. And they've ignored the spread of the hegemony and the proxy terror regime that Iran is supporting. But what's been forgotten about this is the new leader of Iran is guilty of the most horrendous crimes against his own people. And if this case is successful, the next step would be taken not only to sentence Nori, but take the trial to the International Criminal Court to investigate the president of Iran for mass human rights crimes, mass executions, and bring him to court.
Yeah, I'm not too optimistic about that. The world has shown how weak it is when it comes to Iran and even enforcing, them not getting nuclear weapons, etc.
It's a slim chance, but this has to be exposed, and Iran has to be sanctioned and isolated until Raisi is being brought to the International Criminal Court or sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council for these crimes, because the pleas of the Iranian people have been ignored by people like Obama. They're being ignored by Biden right now.
We have to end it right there,
Barry. Put this on the top of the list.
Barry, we got to end it. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Very important information you shared. Thank you. Barry Shaw.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom!
Okay, wait a minute.
Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.